This is a tutorial for a face mask for beginning sewers. There's a pattern available on the link below. You're going to want to print that out, cut out the pattern, and gather your materials, which include elastic, wire, and bias tape. The wire goes in the nose section to make a more fitted mask. And then you're going to need some fabric. I am using woven fabric as opposed to knitted fabric. Knits are think like t-shirts. These are fabrics that don't stretch, so they're easier to sew. I'm going to use this floral print, this sheeting that goes on the inside, and the denim. I've pre-washed all of these fabrics so that they can be sanitized when they're made up into the mask. That's very important. I sometimes use coated cotton or nylon ripstop, so those are totally great options too. So now on to the cutting phase. We are going to cut our fabric. I'm going to actually stack the fabrics and then put the pattern on top and then use my rotary cutter. So you might notice I have a cutting mat underneath. You can get smaller cutting mats. This is a nice big cutting mat because I cut a lot of things. So what you're going to want to do is layer your fabrics. These two fabrics don't have patterns, so you don't have to worry about direction. This pattern, you're going to want to pay attention a little more to the direction of the fabric. So if you can see here, this is called a selvage. And so that's the finished edge of the fabric. I'm going to match those up. And generally a print is printed, if it's directional, it will be printed running this way. So you'll want your mask to probably be like this so that the top will be here, the bottom will be here. So just something, it doesn't always matter with some prints. This print, you could probably get away with it, but you just want to be aware of that when you're cutting. So now we're going to cut. I like to use a ruler to hold my pattern down. You could pin it. I find that pins make it a little bit wonky, so I'm just going to go ahead and use this. You want to be very careful when you use a rotary cutter to not have your fingers in the way, because this is very sharp. It's like an X-Acto knife that rolls. So sort of a pizza cutter and an X-Acto knife. All right, so now I'm just going to cut this. I do have markings on the pattern, but really you can just do a little bit of winging it as far as like the exact opening, exactly where the elastic go. Don't get too hung up on that. It'll be just fine. So you want to always close the rotary cutter when you're done with it. So put that aside. So as you can see, I have 2 pieces of the outer print, 2 pieces of an inner print, and 2 pieces of the face side. Or you could reverse it and have this be the outer side and then this be the face side, which actually it's a really nice soft cotton, so that would be nice. So basically this is going to make a reversible face mask. All right, so now we are on to the sewing phase. So here we are at the sewing machine. You don't need a fancy sewing machine. This is actually a rather basic sewing machine. You're really only going to use the forwards and backwards straight stitch. You could use a zigzag stitch if you wanted to finish the seams, but you don't have to get really hung up on that. I happen to have a serger, so that's how I finish my seams. You probably want to just take a seam gauge or a ruler to see exactly where your 1/4 inch mark is. It doesn't have to be a 1/4 inch, but I would say don't make it any smaller because you want to make sure that your seams hold together once everything is put together. So if you can see, this marks off 1 inch and a 1/4 inch is right here. So we're just going to look at where our needle is and kind of where we're going to look as a guide. So about here. I'm going to make sure my right sides are together, so you can sort of tell on a print it's more clear on this side than on this side. It looks a little more faded. So you just want to make sure that your right sides are together. So I'm going to put it in here under the presser. This is called the presser foot. So you put that down. I've gotten in the habit over the years of always putting my needle down. I think a lot of new machines do that for you. And then you take a stitch or 2, and then this is what makes my machine go backwards. So that's called the back tack. And that's important at the beginning of a seam so that it locks it in. It creates kind of a knot And we are just gonna follow the line. And then I do a back stitch again. And that's my first piece sewn. So if you open it up, you can see there's a nice strong seam there. And I'm going to continue to do that on the other two pieces. So now we have our 3 pieces of fabric with the center seam sewn. Now we're going to make a sandwich. So we have this piece, and this is the right side. The seam is finished. It's going to go against this one that has the center seam here. So I'm going to pair those together, and then the lining piece that won't be seen will just go right behind here. So we're kind of sandwiching the print. I'm matching up the center seams and putting a pin to keep them together and kind of keep them pretty matched. You want the edges to, you don't have to get super picky about it, but you want them to be basically kind of lined up together. So there they are. And let's go ahead and sew the top edge. Take it to the machine. And we place it at our mark. Put the presser foot down, very important, always do that. Back tack, oops. And we're just gonna shift it as we need. Stitch along. You obviously want to take your pin out and not sew over it because that would break the needle. It's not very fun to deal with. Get to the end, back tack. Press your foot up, cut the thread, and so now those are all together. And what I like to do is sew the bottom edge, leaving an opening, and then I sew the 2 sides that have the elastic because it's a little tricky when you're inserting the elastic. So I find it makes it a little easier. So we're just there. Back tack all the way back. Sewing along, and then I come to about there, and I'm going to back tack to make a knot so that I'm leaving an opening for being able to flip and turn the right sides out. So that's just a kind of a basic sewing concept. Like if you're making a pillowcase, you sew it all together and then you flip it right side out. All right, so there, back tack, and I sew, and then I back tack, and that's it. And the next step is putting the elastic in. So now we're at the phase where we're putting in our elastic. The elastics I cut about 6 1/4 inch long, and you want to make sure you insert them between the right sides of the 2 outer fabrics. So I just fold it and pop it in there. And I typically leave a little bit hanging out so that I know it's in there. I take it to the machine, and I actually usually start a little bit after the top edge of the elastic, and then I back tack over it. And then I sew forward, and then I might even back tack it again because you want to make sure those little suckers stay on there. There we go. And you just do that on the other side, the same thing. So we have our piece all stitched together. Our elastics are in there, back tacked really securely. We have one last step before we turn it, which is putting a little channel for our wire. So again, this is our wire. It's about 4 1/4 inches. This happens to be bias tape that's been cut in half, but you could cut a little narrow strip of fabric, or if you have some sort of a tube, I don't know, maybe an old shoelace or something, you can cut this length and use. You just need a channel basically for the wire. So I kind of press it in half to create a crease where I'm going to put it at the center seam, and I pin it there. Just kind of pin it that way. So this end we want to fold over so that it kind of seals that little wire in there. And I find just folding it this way is the easiest. And we take it to our machine. And I want it to be a little bit less than the 1/4 of an inch that is our seam. So that's why I'm positioning it there. So again, you back tack. That's how you always start a seam that you don't want to have fall out. I've just matched it up to the edge here. So long. This really doesn't have to be that perfect. You just basically want to have a little channel for that wire. Okay, so that is finished. And you have a little place to insert that wire. You could even do 2 wires if you want a really stiff nose bit. It's to kind of shape the area around your face. So now we need to close off that little channel. You want to make sure that you don't sew over the wire because that will break your needle. So I'm going to take a stitch or 2 and then I'm going to back tack. I'm going to take some stitches and that will sort of close that little channel. Now the moment of truth. We go to the right sides and we turn it. And we're going to just make sure that everything is stitched, that all of our seams are sealed. Our elastic is in there nice and tight. You can feel the wire right there. And so then we have this. So there's your face mask. And we still have this bit. Now, I generally just machine stitch these shut. You could, if you wanted, you could hand stitch. But I think just machine stitching nowadays is pretty fine. So you can pin it if you want. And I'd say if you're, slightly more on the inexperienced sewing, you might want to give it a pin or 2. Okay, so now we are going to just close up that little opening. Take a few stitches, we back tack to make our little knot. And again, it doesn't have to be completely perfect. It's kind of nice to see a little bit of the handmade quality, I find. Stitch a little further and then we back tack. And cut the thread. So you're going to want to just take your scissors and trim off any little threads. Like that. And then there is your face mask.